What was Gerald Ford actually hiding when he climbed on that cabinet room table beside his wife on her last day in the White House? And why did America's honest marriage run on what one of the two of them was allowed not to know? Before we go any further, do me a small favor. If this kind of slow burn breakdown lands for you, tap like, hit subscribe, and send this to someone who still thinks the Fords were the simple ones. That one share is the only thing keeping this kind of work alive on YouTube. The famous photograph shows Betty Ford in stocking feet on the cabinet room table, striking a dancer's pose, smiling the way she always smiled. The date was January 19, 1977. Her husband was packing his things down the hall. The country had lost the election 2 months earlier. America kept that image like a souvenir. It was supposed to be one of those rare feel-good moments from a White House that had no scandals because the people inside it were decent. That is the picture. It is also a portrait of a woman who had spent 30 years in Washington being managed, scheduled, hidden, and prescribed to, and who finally got to stand on the only table that had ever belonged to her job. Her husband would not see that photograph for another 17 years. Why that gap exists tells you almost everything about the marriage. To understand why it hurts, you have to start at the beginning, because the whole story runs on the same pattern. Gerald Ford proposed in early 1948. He was 34, a Grand Rapids lawyer and Michigan football star with a war record he never mentioned and a yard sign campaign that had not yet started. Betty Bloomer was 29, recently divorced, working as a fashion coordinator at a local department store, and a former dancer who had performed at Carnegie Hall with Martha Graham's auxiliary troupe. Ford asked her to marry him. Then he told her they could not do it until the fall, and he would not explain why. There were two reasons. The first was political, and he kept it to himself. He was planning to challenge the sitting Republican congressman in Michigan's 5th District in that September's primary. In a district that's safe, the primary was the election. A premature announcement could collapse his chances, so he quietly dated his wedding around his own campaign launch and let his fiancée wonder. The second reason was her. In western Michigan in 1948, the woman he wanted to marry was a divorced former professional dancer, and he was not sure how the voters would feel about that. He never put that sentence in a press release. She never framed it as a slight, at least not in print. But the math was done, and she was the variable. They married on October 15, 1948, 3 weeks before the general election. Close enough to look devoted, late enough to be safe. The date of her wedding was set by other people's ballots. Read that again. To know why she tolerated the arrangement, you have to know what she had already survived and what she had already learned about not raising her voice. Elizabeth Ann Bloomer was born in Chicago in 1918, the only daughter of a traveling salesman for the Royal Rubber Company. The family moved to Grand Rapids. Her father, William, was on the road constantly. In the summer of 1934, Betty was 16, and her father was found dead in the family garage. He had been working under the car, carbon monoxide. The garage doors were open. He died the day before his 60th birthday. Decades later, Betty wrote that she had not known her father was an alcoholic, not as a child, not as a teenager. She learned the word afterward from her mother in a household that had spent years arranging itself around a fact nobody stated out loud. That was her first education. A family survives by not saying the thing. She grew up, taught dance to neighborhood kids, modeled clothes locally, taught movement to children with disabilities at Mary Free Bed. She was good at it. She wanted out. Out looked like Bennington, Vermont. 2 summers at the School of the Dance where she met Martha Graham, then New York, where she danced at Carnegie Hall with Graham's auxiliary troupe and modeled for the John Robert Powers Agency to cover rent. She was talented. She was not yet indispensable, and the inner circle around Graham was small and hard to break into. So when her mother came to New York and asked her to come home, she came back. She was 23, running the fashion department at the store where she had once modeled coats. The distance she had traveled to get to the center of American modern dance, and the distance she had traveled to get back are two different numbers. The decision people skip is the one that explains everything. In 1942, she married William C. Warren, a traveling salesman she had known since childhood. He was charming. They moved every couple of years, Toledo, Syracuse, Grand Rapids, and she took department store jobs wherever they landed. She later wrote that she had wanted a house and children and had married a man who wanted the next town. By 1947, she had decided the marriage was over. Then Warren collapsed, diabetic coma. He was gravely ill for nearly 2 years. She did not leave. She worked, she nursed him. She waited until leaving him would not look like abandoning a sick man, and only then did she file. The divorce came through in September 1947 on the grounds available to women in Michigan at the time. Sit with that for a second. Betty Ford's defining instinct was not passivity, it was timing. She stayed through the hard part and she moved when moving was defensible. She also later said that the divorce in Grand Rapids in 1947 came with a permanent asterisk and that she felt it for the rest of her life. Then she met Gerald Ford. He called and asked her for a drink. She said she was still technically married. He came anyway. He said he had 20 minutes. He stayed an hour. He was a Yale-trained lawyer, a Navy veteran who had served on the carrier Monterey in the Pacific, a man who did not drink much and did not boast, and did show up when he said he would. After Bill Warren, stability looked like romance. There is one more layer that almost nobody pointed out at the time. Gerald Ford worried in private about the political cost of marrying a divorced woman. Gerald Ford was himself born Leslie Lynch King Jr. His own mother had fled a violent husband when he was an infant, divorced, remarried, and given her son the name of the man who raised him. He did not learn the full story until he was a teenager. The man running the numbers on her divorce was a product of one. Neither of them ever framed it as a slight. The arithmetic was done, and she was the variable. So when she said yes in October 1948, she knew what she was getting. He had been campaigning before he was officially campaigning. He canvassed farms. He shook hands at factory gates before sunrise. The night before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, he left early to give a political speech. On the day of the wedding at Grace Episcopal Church in Grand Rapids, she wore sapphire blue. He arrived late. He had been out working farm country, and his shoes were still muddy. She joked afterward that if he had taken any longer, she would have run off with the best man. That is a line a bride makes so nobody has to say the other thing. The reception was functionally a campaign event. The honeymoon lasted about a day. They went to a Dewey rally, then to a Michigan football game, then back to the district. He won the general election 3 weeks later. It was the first of 13 consecutive terms. They moved to a small apartment near Washington, then to a house in Alexandria. 4 children arrived between 1950 and 1957. Ford's ambition was the Speaker of the House, which meant campaigning for other Republicans in other districts, which meant the road. By the mid-1960s, in his heaviest years, the family's own estimate of his time on the road ran to roughly 258 nights a year. She later wrote that she could not say, "Wait until your father gets home," because their father was not coming home for a week. She did not complain publicly. Not once. Not for years. That silence was read as contentment. It would be quoted back to her for the rest of her life as proof of a happy marriage. It was the same skill she had picked up in the Bloomer house in Grand Rapids, where nobody mentioned why the salesman drank. Then came the injury. In 1964 or 1965, sources differ by a year, she reached up to open a window in the Alexandria house, and something in her neck gave out. A pinched nerve turned into chronic pain, and the chronic pain sat on top of a spine that was already showing osteoarthritis. The pain was treated the way American medicine treated a congressman's wife in the mid-1960s, generously. She was prescribed opioids. She was prescribed benzodiazepines. Other medications were layered on. Nobody in the chain was counting. This was not a back alley problem. Every pill she took was written on a pad by a doctor who believed he was helping. For the next 14 years, no one in that system asked her the question that mattered, which was what she was drinking while she took them. Because she was drinking, not dramatically. She later described herself in that period as a controlled drinker. The reliable end-of-day glass of a woman alone in a house in Virginia with 4 children and a husband on a plane somewhere. Then the pills arrived, and the two started working on each other. The timing of that stretch should bother you. The same years in which her medication started, Gerald Ford was elected House Minority Leader. January 1965. The biggest promotion of his life, and the moment his schedule got worse, not better. She went to a psychiatrist once a week for about 2 years. She later dated the beginning to around 1962 in some accounts. Other accounts place it after the injury. The substance is consistent. In interviews she later gave at a time when admitting to psychiatric treatment could still end a political career, she said the work was about her sense of worth. She was past Carnegie Hall by 30 years. She was the woman who drove the carpool and organized the Sunday school class and was introduced at every event as Jerry's wife. Her psychiatrist told her she had to start believing she was valuable as herself. That is what she remembered most. Notice what he missed. He was rebuilding her self-esteem while she was mixing prescription opioids with alcohol, and he did not register the drinking. Neither did her internist. Neither did her husband, who was again not there. The most consequential fact of the next decade of her life went unnoticed by every professional and every relative in the room for years because she was polite, functional, well-dressed, and married to a man everyone liked. The cruelty in this story is not a villain. It is a system, with no one in it assigned to look at her. If this has been worth your time, do not just leave a like. Drop a comment with the moment in the marriage that hit you hardest. The comments change what I write next, and they are the only signal this channel actually needs to keep going. By the early 1970s, she had extracted a promise from her husband. He had spent a quarter-century chasing the Speaker's chair. The Republicans kept failing to take the House, and he had agreed with her that he would run one more time in 1974 and then retire. She had an end date. The escape route was back on the calendar the way her wedding date had once been, except this time the calendar was hers. In October 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned in a bribery scandal, and Richard Nixon picked Gerald Ford to replace him. She would later say that she had been happily counting down to a normal life. Instead, in December 1973, she stood in the East Room and watched her husband sworn in as vice president. 8 months later, on August 9, 1974, Nixon boarded the helicopter, Gerald Ford became president, and Betty Ford became First Lady. She had not been elected to anything. She had not been consulted about any of it, and she had been on prescription narcotics for roughly a decade. Then in September 1974, a routine physical at Bethesda Naval Hospital turned up a lump in her right breast. She had a modified radical mastectomy. The country was told in detail, diagnosis, surgery, recovery, because she decided it would be that way. In 1974, the word breast was barely printable in a family newspaper. First ladies did not have visible body parts. The medical convention of the era was to put a woman under anesthesia for a biopsy and remove the breast in the same operation if the tissue came back malignant. So many women went asleep not knowing what they would wake up without. Betty Ford described her own surgery to the press and told American women to examine themselves. Clinics were overwhelmed. Weeks later, Happy Rockefeller found her own tumor during a self-exam and had surgery. For 26 years, the machinery of publicity had been used on her. Her wedding had been scheduled around it. Her divorce had been hidden from it. In a hospital bed in Bethesda, she picked the machinery up and used it herself. The medication had come into the White House with her, and the new job involved standing for hours in receiving lines. Her neck had not healed. The next 18 months were the strangest and best of her life. She lobbied state legislators personally on the Equal Rights Amendment by telephone from the White House, which infuriated conservatives who thought a First Lady's phone should be about China patterns. She pushed her husband to appoint women. She said things out loud. Then on August 10, 1975, The morally safer interview on 60 Minutes aired. She called Roe v. Wade a great decision and said abortion belonged in hospitals rather than the backwoods. She said if marijuana had been around when she was young, she probably would have tried it and assumed her kids had. She confirmed she had seen a psychiatrist. Safer asked if she had ever doubted her husband's fidelity. She said she had perfect faith in him, that she was glad to see him enjoy a pretty girl, that she would only worry when he stopped looking, and that he didn't have time for outside entertainment because she kept him busy. Asked what she would do if her daughter told her she was having an affair, she said she would not be surprised. Susan was a normal human being like all young girls. The mail room was buried within days. Ministers denounced her from the pulpit. The Republican right, already circling Ford for being insufficiently conservative, picked up a new grievance with a face on it. The famous line is that the president threw a pillow at her and said she had just cost him 10 million votes, then raised it to 20. Treat that carefully. It comes to us through later family retellings, not a contemporary record, and the kind of anecdote that gets funnier and rounder each decade a family repeats it. What is documented is that he spent the following days at the podium carefully declining to disagree with his wife in public. Her approval sank, then climbed past his. By the 1976 campaign, supporters wore buttons that read, "Vote for Betty's husband." Campaign staff began restricting where she could appear because she was polling as more liberal than the Democratic nominee's wife. Read the through line. In 1948, she was the divorced dancer the candidate had to schedule around. In 1976, she was the asset his own aides had to manage. Election night 1976 was close and went the wrong way. Ford had campaigned himself. By the end, he had almost no voice left. The next morning, in front of the cameras, Betty Ford read her husband's concession statement to the country while he stood beside her, silent. That is the last public image of the marriage in power. She spoke, he could not. 2 months later came the cabinet room table. Kennerly, the White House photographer, was with her. She took off her shoes, climbed up, struck the pose. He shot a few frames on a small Leica. He did not publish them. Not that year, not for a long time. Then they went to California, to a house at Thunderbird Country Club in Rancho Mirage. The audience went away. The desert nearly killed her, and the reason is almost mundane. Everything that had been holding her upright had been structural. The schedule, the staff, the rooms full of people at 3 in the afternoon. Strip those out, and what remained was a woman in her late 50s in a house in the California desert with a bad neck, an empty nest, a husband who had immediately started traveling again on the post-presidential circuit, and the same absences in new scenery. The medication increased. The drinking increased. She was narrating her own life into a tape recorder for a memoir with the journalist Chris Chase when she was not shuffling from one room to another. Her speech slowed. She fell alone in the bathroom one night. Her family had spent a long time on the standard maneuvers, watering down the drinks, covering for the missed lunch, explaining the slur as fatigue. The Bloomer method. Manage it, do not name it. Susan broke it. Susan Ford was 20. She lived nearby in Palm Desert. In the spring of 1978, she connected with a Navy physician who worked in the new field of chemical dependency. The first attempt was small. Susan, a family doctor and Betty's personal assistant, walked in, and Betty had already taken her morning medication. She threw them out. 2 days later, on April 1, 1978, they came back with everyone. Gerald Ford, all 4 children, and Dr. Joseph Persh, who would run the treatment. Ford spoke first. Then each child, one at a time, described what they had watched. Susan told her mother that she had grown up wanting to be a dancer because her mother had been one, and that she was not that person anymore. It lasted about 2 hours. Betty's own account is not grateful and is not tidy. She said they went around the room telling her she had let them down, that it cut her, and that she had spent her whole life devoted to them. She agreed to go. Then she went to her bedroom and dressed carefully to demonstrate how well she was, took the 4 or 5 pills she always took at noon, and left for the Long Beach Naval Hospital. The decision that made her the most consequential First Lady of the 20th century came 3 weeks later, on April 21, 1978. The first statement in early April had admitted only to overmedication, a respectable, blameless, femininely acceptable problem. She could have stopped there and no one would have pushed her. She did not stop. She said she was addicted not only to the medication but to alcohol. No prominent American woman had ever said that in public before. The word alcoholic applied to a wife and mother was a moral verdict, not a diagnosis. She had watched her own family refuse to attach the word to her father for 16 years. Her memoir was already in production. She had it reopened, and a final chapter added about Long Beach. It came out that October under the title she had chosen before any of this happened, The Times of My Life. A book about being First Lady ending in a Navy detox ward. Everything after this was Betty Ford deciding what the previous decades had been for. In October 1982, the Betty Ford Center opened in Rancho Mirage. She had raised the money herself with Leonard Firestone and chaired the board until 2005. She insisted on features that nobody else in the field was doing. Equal beds for women, because treatment programs of the era were built around men. A family program because she had personally learned that addiction is a household arrangement. A policy that put a construction worker in the same group as a movie star. She greeted new patients herself. "Hello, my name is Betty Ford, and I am an alcoholic and a drug addict." She said the sentence her mother never said. Look at what that did to the marriage. It did not repair it in any conventional sense. Gerald Ford kept traveling, kept his boards and his speeches, never became a man who was home, but the arrangement inverted. The center was hers. The money she had raised was hers. The name on the building was hers. For the first time since 1948, the household had an institution in it that belonged to her. He became the spouse who flew in for the ceremonies. He also did one thing on his own. On national television, he called the intervention the hardest thing his family ever did, and he did not pretend he had noticed the problem himself. He had not. That is the point. 58 years, mostly one bedroom, and he missed 14 years of it, which brings us back to the table. Kennerly sat on his negatives for 17 years. In 1994, after leaving the Secret Service and going public with his archive, he asked her permission and she gave it. Gerald Ford saw the photograph of his wife dancing on the cabinet room table for the first time as an old man in California. His line, in paraphrase, was the kind of sentence that only works if the speaker is also the punchline. Something close to, "Betty, you never told me you did that." She said there was a lot she had not told him. She meant it as a joke. Everyone laughed. It is also the single most accurate statement anyone ever made about that marriage. He died on December 26, 2006 at age 93 in their Rancho Mirage home, with Betty holding his hand. She outlived him by 4.5 years and made almost no public appearances. When she died on July 8, 2011 at age 93, her casket was flown to Grand Rapids and lay in the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum overnight. She was buried beside him on July 14, 2011, which would have been his 98th birthday. Read that as devotion if you like. Read it as her last piece of scheduling. Here is where the story lands. Gerald Ford's presidency lasted 895 days and is remembered mainly for a pardon. Her institution has treated tens of thousands of people and merged into a national foundation that still carries her name. Say the word Ford to an American under 50 today, and there is a real chance they think of the rehab first and the president second. In 2024, the Postal Service put her on a stamp, and it was her daughter Susan, the same Susan who had walked into that house and refused to manage the silence, who stood in the East Room for the unveiling. The wedding picture from Grace Episcopal is in the Ford Library in Ann Arbor, in the same collection as the 60 Minutes transcript, in the same collection as her own papers. She put it all in one place and let historians have it, which is not what the wives of powerful men usually do with the evidence. She had been trained as a child in a Grand Rapids house that a family survives by not saying the word. She spent the next 40 years being scheduled, delayed, hidden, prescribed to, and left alone 258 nights a year by a man everybody agreed was decent. And he was decent, which is why nobody looked closer. Then she said the word in public with her name on it, and the saying of it became what she is remembered for. So hold the photograph again. A small woman in stocking feet on the cabinet room table in an empty room on her way out the door, posing for one witness and no press. People have printed it as a joke, a farewell, a bit of charm from the last honest couple in Washington. It is not a joke. It is a woman who was never given a seat at that table taking 30 years late and telling nobody in her own house about it for 17 years. The marriage everyone envied ran on what he was allowed not to know. She ended it by telling the rest of us first.